The candle in Eleanor Hartley's hand shook as she stood outside the drawing-room door, listening to her stepmother's voice rise sharp and cold on the other side of the wood. "She will not come to the ball tonight," Margaret Vane said. "She has nothing to wear, and I will not have my daughters embarrassed by a girl dressed like a servant." Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the door frame to steady herself. She had known this moment was coming for weeks, ever since the invitation from Lord Denby's estate had arrived with 3 names written on the card, and hers left off entirely. Still, hearing the words spoken so plainly made her chest tighten, as though a hand had closed around it. She was 22 years old, and for the last 6 years she had lived in this house as a guest who was never quite welcome and a daughter who was never quite claimed. Her father, Edmund Hartley, had married Margaret when Eleanor was 16, hoping to give his only child a mother again after years of grief. He had not lived long enough to see what that hope would become. 2 winters after the wedding, a fever took him in the space of 9 days, and with him went the last person in that house who had ever looked at Eleanor with real tenderness. What he left behind was complicated. The Hartley name still carried some weight in certain circles, old friendships and old debts of gratitude that had not yet faded, but the money that once supported that name had thinned to almost nothing. Edmund had made poor investments in his final years, trusting men he should not have trusted, and by the time the lawyers finished untangling his affairs, there was barely enough left to keep the house standing, let alone to dress 3 young women for a London season. Margaret had never forgiven him for that, though he was no longer there to hear it. She poured what little remained into her own daughters, Cordelia and Marguerite, buying them gowns and gloves and dancing lessons, while Eleanor mended curtains and counted candles, and learned to disappear into corners so that she would not be a reminder of money that had run out. Inside the drawing-room now, Cordelia's voice joined her mother's. "Honestly, Mama, it would be a mercy. She stands in a corner all evening looking like she wishes the floor would open beneath her. It puts everyone off their dancing." There was a ripple of laughter, Marguerite's included, light and careless, the kind of laughter that did not know it was unkind because it had never had to think about what such words cost. Eleanor closed her eyes and made herself breathe slowly, the way she had taught herself to do over the years whenever the words became too sharp to hold quietly inside her chest. She was not going to cry. She had made herself a promise long ago, on the night of her father's funeral, that she would not let this house see her cry again. Sadness here was treated as weakness to be mocked, not sorrow to be comforted, and she had learned that lesson early and thoroughly. The door opened before she could step back, and Margaret Vane appeared in the frame, tall and elegant in deep blue silk, her expression cooling the moment she saw Eleanor standing there. "Listening again," Margaret said, though it was not truly a question. "I suppose you heard everything then. It saves me the trouble of explaining." "I heard," Eleanor said quietly. "Good, then you understand there is no gown suitable for you, and even if there were, I would rather save the carriage seat for someone who can actually be of use to this family tonight." Margaret's eyes moved over Eleanor's plain gray dress, the one she had let out twice already as the years passed, and something like distaste crossed her face. "You may stay and see to the household accounts. Mrs. Fenwick will need help preparing the linens for when we return with guests." It was not a request. Eleanor had learned long ago that nothing in this house was ever truly a request when it came from Margaret Vane. She lowered her eyes, the posture that had kept the peace for 6 years, and said only, "Yes, madam." Margaret swept past her without another word, calling for the carriage, calling for her daughters to hurry, filling the hallway with the particular kind of urgency that came before a grand evening. Cordelia and Marguerite followed a moment later, dressed in gowns of rose silk and pale green, their hair arranged with fresh flowers, their faces bright with the excitement of young women who had never once had to wonder whether they belonged somewhere. Cordelia paused just long enough to glance at Eleanor, a small, satisfied smile touching her lips. "Do try not to look so miserable, Eleanor. It really isn't becoming." "I'm not miserable," Eleanor said, and found, to her own surprise, that it was mostly true. She had stopped expecting invitations to include her name a long time ago. What stung was not the exclusion itself but the casual, practiced ease with which it was delivered, as if she were a piece of furniture that had simply been left out of the room's arrangement. Marguerite, gentler than her sister though rarely brave enough to act on it, offered Elinor a quick, apologetic look before following her mother out the door. It was the closest thing to kindness Elinor had received all week, and she held on to it as the front door closed, and the sound of carriage wheels rolled away down the gravel drive, leaving the house suddenly, thoroughly quiet. For a long moment Elinor simply stood in the hallway, the candle still burning low in her hand, listening to the silence settle over the house like dust. Then she walked to the narrow window at the end of the corridor and watched the lanterns of the carriage grow smaller in the darkness, carrying her stepfamily toward an evening of music and laughter and possibility, none of which had ever been meant for her. She thought, not for the first time, of the girl she had been before her father died. That girl had believed the world owed her nothing unkind, had believed love was something steady and reliable, the way the sun rising each morning was reliable. That girl had not yet learned what it felt like to be quietly erased from her own family, to watch her home become someone else's stage, while she stood in the wings holding props no one wanted to see. Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, found her still standing at the window some minutes later. She was an older woman with a soft, weathered face and eyes that had watched Elinor grow from a laughing child into the careful, quiet young woman she had become. Of everyone left in the house, Mrs. Fenwick was the only one who had never stopped treating Elinor as though she mattered. "You're not to trouble yourself over the linens tonight," Mrs. Fenwick said gently, coming to stand beside her. "I've already seen to them. Come and sit by the kitchen fire instead. I've kept back a plate for you, and there's tea besides." Elinor managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Fenwick." "You didn't have to do that." "No," the older woman agreed. "But someone in this house ought to remember to look after you, since it seems no one else troubles themselves too." They walked together toward the kitchen, and for a while Elinor allowed herself to simply exist without performing gratitude or invisibility, sitting at the worn wooden table while Mrs. Fenwick fussed over the kettle and spoke of small, ordinary things: the price of flour, the state of the garden, anything that was not about balls or Earls or the particular ache of being left behind again. It was Mrs. Fenwick who first mentioned the letter. "It came this afternoon while you were upstairs," she said, drawing a folded paper from the pocket of her apron. "Addressed to you directly. I nearly gave it to your stepmother by habit, but something told me to hold it back." Elinor took the letter with careful fingers, turning it over to see the seal, an unfamiliar crest pressed into dark wax. Her heart gave an odd, uncertain flutter as she broke it open and unfolded the page inside. The handwriting was elegant, confident, clearly belonging to someone who had never once doubted that their words would be read with attention. It was a letter from her father's cousin, a woman named Harriet Ashworth whom Elinor had not seen since she was a small child, informing her that she had been invited, by name, to attend a private gathering hosted at Rothwell House the following week, in honor of a family connection too old and too meaningful to be forgotten, regardless of the family's current circumstances. Elinor read the letter twice, then a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less astonishing on a fourth reading. Rothwell House. Even she, who paid little attention to society gossip, knew that name. It belonged to Alexander Rothwell, Duke of Ashfield, a man spoken of in every drawing room in London as the most sought-after, most carefully watched bachelor of the entire season, a man whose attention could raise a family's fortune with a single dance, and whose disinterest could just as easily let it sink without comment. "What is it?" Mrs. Fenwick asked, watching Elinor's face change. "I don't quite know," Elinor admitted, folding the letter carefully. "But I think, for the first time in a very long while, someone has remembered that I exist." Outside, the night had grown fully dark, and somewhere across the city her stepmother and stepsisters were laughing beneath chandeliers, certain that the world belonged to them and only them. Elinor did not yet know what the letter in her hands would come to mean, did not yet know that it would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually place her, of all people, at the very center of the story everyone in London would soon be telling. She only knew, as she sat by the kitchen fire with the letter pressed against her chest, that something in her quiet, overlooked life had just begun, quite unexpectedly, to shift. 3 weeks passed before the letter from Rothwell House stopped feeling like something Alina had imagined in a tired moment by the fire. In that time, the household had turned entirely toward the business of triumph, because both Cordelia and Marguerite had done what Margaret Vane had spent 6 years scheming for. They had each caught the eye of a wealthy earl, and London society, always hungry for a fresh piece of gossip to pass between drawing rooms, had decided the Vane sisters were the story of the season. Cordelia's earl was Lord Denby, a broad-shouldered man in his early 30s with a fortune built on shipping and land in the north, and a reputation for being pleasant enough company as long as everyone around him agreed with his opinions. Marguerite's earl was Lord Camden, quieter and more reserved, a widower some years older than her, who seemed genuinely fond of her gentle laugh and her habit of humming while she arranged flowers. Neither match had come as a surprise to anyone who knew Margaret Vane, since she had spent the better part of 2 seasons positioning her daughters at exactly the right balls, exactly the right card tables, exactly the right pews at church, until fortune, or rather careful engineering, had finally delivered its reward. The engagements were announced within a week of each other, and the house on Grafton Street, which had known so much quiet strain over unpaid bills and mended curtains, suddenly filled with the noise of triumph. Deliveries of silk and lace arrived by the crate. Seamstresses came and went at all hours. Margaret walked through the halls with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had finally been proven right about everything she had ever believed regarding beauty, patience, and the correct application of both. Alina was given a role in all of it, though not the role of a sister sharing in her family's joy. She was given the role of an extra pair of hands. She pressed hems and pinned sleeves and carried trays of tea to rooms full of visiting relatives who complimented Cordelia's complexion and Marguerite's figure, and never once turned to ask Alina how she did. She had grown so used to this particular kind of invisibility that she barely noticed it anymore, the way one stops noticing a draft in a house one has lived in long enough. What she did notice, and what she found harder to ignore, was the way her stepsisters had begun to speak about their futures as though those futures were owed to them rather than granted by circumstance. Cordelia, standing before the long mirror in the upstairs parlor while a seamstress adjusted the waist of her wedding gown, spoke often of the house she would have in the country, the carriages, the staff who would answer to her alone. "I shall have my own lady's maid," Cordelia said one afternoon, turning this way and that to admire the fall of the fabric. "Someone whose sole occupation is to see to my hair and my gowns. No more sharing Nancy's attention with Mother and Marguerite both." "You'll want someone with a delicate hand," Marguerite offered from the settee, where she sat sorting through swatches of ribbon. "Lord Camden says his mother's maid was famous for her curling irons. Perhaps we could ask after her." Alina, kneeling nearby with a box of pins, said nothing. There was no place in this conversation for her opinion, and she had learned that offering one unasked only invited a sharper reminder of her position. She focused instead on the careful, steady work of her hands, pinning fabric, straightening seams, letting the conversation wash past her like water around a stone. It was Margaret who eventually turned the talk in a direction Alina found harder to remain silent through. "Of course," Margaret said, settling into her favorite chair with the particular satisfaction of a woman discussing a subject she had rehearsed many times in her own mind. "An earl is a fine match, a very fine match indeed, but I have heard that the Duke of Ashfield is expected to choose a wife before the year is through. His grandmother has apparently grown impatient waiting for him to settle, and there is talk that whoever secures his interest will find herself the most envied woman in England." "They say he is unbearably particular," Cordelia said, wrinkling her nose slightly. "Lady Whitmore told me he has refused 3 proposals already this season alone, simply because the young ladies bored him." "Bored him," Margaret repeated thoughtfully. "Then he wants someone clever. Someone who can hold a conversation without simply agreeing with everything he says." Or someone very beautiful, Marguerite suggested. Men like that are rarely looking for cleverness. They are looking for something to admire. Elinor kept her eyes on her work, but she found herself thinking, with a small and private amusement she did not dare show, that both her stepsisters had just described qualities neither of them possessed in any great abundance. Cordelia was handsome enough but had never in her life allowed a conversation to travel anywhere except back toward herself. Marguerite was sweet and pretty, but she had a habit of repeating whatever opinion had been most recently spoken in her presence, as though she trusted other people's judgment more than her own. She thought of the letter still folded carefully in the drawer of her small writing desk upstairs, the invitation to Rothwell House that she had not yet found the courage to mention to anyone in this room. She did not know why she had kept it secret. Perhaps some instinct told her that the moment Margaret learned of it, the invitation would somehow be twisted into an opportunity for Cordelia or Marguerite instead, folded seamlessly into their triumph the way everything good in this house eventually was. That evening, after the seamstresses had gone and the house had quieted into its usual hush, Elinor sat at her writing desk and took the letter out again. She read it slowly by candlelight, studying each line as though she might find some hidden instruction she had missed before. Her father's cousin, Harriet Ashworth, wrote warmly, almost urgently, insisting that Elinor come, that she was remembered fondly by family who had watched her grow from a distance and wished, now that circumstances allowed it, to draw her back into their company. There was a second page to the letter, one Elinor had read only once before and had been almost afraid to read again, because it suggested something she did not quite dare hope for. Harriet mentioned, almost as an aside, that the gathering at Rothwell House would include the Duke himself, along with a small circle of family friends, and that Elinor's presence, as the daughter of a man Harriet had loved dearly as a cousin, would mean a great deal to her. Elinor did not imagine, reading those words, that anything romantic might come of an evening spent among strangers of such elevated rank. She was not foolish enough to dream in that particular direction. What she felt instead, reading the letter a fourth and then a fifth time, was something quieter and perhaps more important than romance. She felt remembered. She felt for the first time in 6 years that somewhere beyond the walls of this house, there existed people who thought of her not as a burden or an afterthought, but as someone worth inviting, worth knowing, worth including simply because she existed. She decided, sitting there in the candlelight with the letter pressed flat beneath her palm, that she would go. The decision brought its own set of difficulties, the most immediate of which was the question of what precisely she would wear. Elinor owned 3 dresses suitable for any occasion beyond ordinary housework, and none of them had been made new in over 3 years. She thought first of asking Margaret for the funds to have something altered, but she dismissed the idea almost as quickly as it arrived. She could already hear the response, could already picture the particular curl of Margaret's mouth at the suggestion that money meant for Cordelia's or Marguerite's trousseau might instead be spent on Elinor attending a gathering that had nothing to do with either of their engagements. Instead, she went to Mrs. Fenwick, who listened to the whole story with growing delight, her hands pressed together at her chest as though Elinor had just told her the ending of a favorite tale. "Rothwell House," Mrs. Fenwick repeated, shaking her head slowly. "Well, I never. Your father would be so proud to see his family remembered by such fine people. We shall have to see what can be done about a gown." What could be done, it turned out, was more than Elinor expected. Mrs. Fenwick disappeared into the attic storage rooms and returned some hours later with a trunk that had belonged to Elinor's own mother, packed away and forgotten since before her death. Inside, wrapped in tissue gone soft and yellow with age, was a gown of deep green silk, old-fashioned in its cut but beautifully made, the kind of fabric that had not been produced cheaply even in its own time. "Your mother wore this to her own presentation, if my memory serves me right," Mrs. Fenwick said, lifting the gown carefully into the candlelight. "It will want some alterations for the current fashion, but the fabric itself is finer than anything your stepsisters have had made new this season. We have time enough to work on it if you're willing to help with the sewing yourself." Elinor touched the silk gently, feeling something rise in her throat that she could not quite name, Grief and gratitude tangled together so tightly she could not separate one from the other. "I would like that very much," she said. Over the following days, whenever the house was quiet and her stepfamily occupied elsewhere, Eleanor and Mrs. Fenwick worked together by lamplight, taking in the waist, adjusting the sleeves, adding small touches that brought the gown closer to the current fashion without losing the elegance of its original design. It became, in its own quiet way, the happiest secret Eleanor had kept in years. A small private project built entirely around the idea that she, too, deserved something beautiful, something chosen with care rather than handed down as an afterthought. She told no one in her stepfamily about the invitation, not because she intended to deceive them, but because she had grown so used to guarding the few good things in her life that secrecy had become instinct. She continued to press hems and carry tea trays and listen to conversations about Earls and country houses, all the while carrying inside her a small, warm certainty that something else, something entirely her own, was coming. The night before the gathering at Rothwell House, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her small room and tried on the finished gown for the first time. The green silk fell beautifully against her frame, catching the candlelight in a way that made her look, for a moment, almost like a stranger, someone poised and lovely rather than the quiet, overlooked girl who mended curtains and disappeared into corners. Mrs. Fenwick, standing behind her with tears gathering unashamedly in her eyes, said only, "Your mother would be so proud, and so would your father. You look every bit the lady you were always meant to be, Eleanor Hartley. Don't you let anyone in that grand house make you feel otherwise." Eleanor looked at her own reflection for a long moment, trying to memorize the feeling of standing there in a gown chosen for her rather than left over from someone else's excess. Tomorrow evening she would walk into Rothwell House as a stranger to nearly everyone present, carrying nothing but a family name that had once meant something, and a quiet hope that had been buried under 6 years of dust. She did not know yet what waited for her there. She only knew that for the first time in a very long while, she intended to walk into a room and be seen. Rothwell House stood at the end of a long gravel drive lined with tall lanterns, each one glowing softly against the dark blue evening sky. Eleanor had seen grand houses before, had walked past them on quiet afternoons and wondered idly what lived behind their tall windows, but she had never actually stepped inside one, and the carriage Harriet Ashworth had sent for her felt, for the whole of the short journey, like something out of a story rather than her own quiet life. She smoothed the green silk of her skirt with nervous fingers as the carriage rolled to a stop, and for one brief moment she considered asking the driver to turn back. It would be so easy to return to Grafton Street, to slip back into her usual gray dress and her usual corner, where at least the disappointments were familiar. But she thought of Mrs. Fenwick's careful stitching, of her mother's gown restored to new life, and she made herself climb down from the carriage before her courage could fail her entirely. Harriet Ashworth met her in the entrance hall, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and a warm, direct manner that reminded Eleanor achingly of her father. "Eleanor Hartley," Harriet said, taking both her hands in greeting. "How very like your father you look. He would be delighted to see you here tonight." "Thank you for inviting me," Eleanor said. "I confess I still do not entirely understand why you remembered me, after so many years. Because your father was dear to me, and because I have watched from a distance for some time now, hearing how little credit you are given in that house you share with your stepmother." Harriet's expression softened. "Family should not forget family, Eleanor, whatever difficulties life places between them. Come, let me introduce you properly to the evening." The gathering was smaller than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 40 guests scattered through 2 connected drawing rooms, the murmur of conversation blending with the soft strains of a string quartet playing near the far windows. Even in its modest size, the room glittered with a kind of wealth Eleanor had never stood inside before. Crystal and gilt and gowns of fabric so fine it seemed to move like water rather than cloth. She felt, for the first several minutes, entirely out of place, certain that every eye in the room could see straight through her borrowed confidence to the mended hems and careful economies beneath it. But no one looked at her that way. Harriet introduced her as Edmund Hartley's daughter, and the name, old and respected among a certain older generation of the London gentry, opened conversations Eleanor had not expected. An elderly gentleman recalled fondly a hunting trip he had once taken with her father. A woman near the refreshment table remembered attending her parents' wedding many years before Eleanor was born. Slowly, gradually, the tight knot of anxiety in Eleanor's chest began to loosen. She was standing near one of the tall windows, admiring the garden beyond the glass in the fading light, when a voice spoke beside her, low and unhurried. "You look as though you're trying to memorize the way out," the voice said, "which tells me either the company has disappointed you already, or you would rather be anywhere else entirely." Eleanor turned, startled, to find a tall man standing a polite distance away, dressed simply for the occasion, without the excessive ornamentation many of the other gentlemen favored. He had dark hair, unfashionably plain in its styling, and an expression that seemed caught between genuine curiosity and quiet amusement. She did not recognize him, and something in his manner suggested he did not expect to be recognized either, as though he were used to observing rooms rather than being observed by them. "Neither actually," Eleanor said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "I was only admiring the garden. It has been a long while since I stood somewhere with a view worth admiring." "A diplomatic answer," the man said, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth, "though I notice it did not actually answer my question." "Perhaps I preferred to answer a different one," Eleanor said. "It seemed more interesting than the one you asked." He laughed at that, a genuine sound, surprised out of him rather than performed for effect, and something about the unguarded honesty of it made Eleanor smile in return before she could stop herself. "That," he said, "is the first entirely honest thing anyone has said to me all evening. Most people in this room are far too occupied agreeing with whatever they imagine I want to hear." "That sounds exhausting," Eleanor said. "You have no idea." He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful rather than assessing, and Eleanor found she did not mind the attention the way she thought she might. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Alexander." "Eleanor," she said, offering only her given name in return, the way he had, though something in the easy confidence of his single word made her wonder briefly whether there was more to it than he had chosen to share. They spoke for a long while after that, standing near the tall window while the party moved and murmured around them. Eleanor found, somewhat to her own astonishment, that conversation with him came easily, without the careful calculation she had grown so used to applying to every interaction in her stepmother's house. He asked her opinion, and seemed genuinely interested in the answer, rather than waiting for a pause in which to redirect the topic back toward himself. He spoke of books he had read, of a recent trip to the countryside where he had spent an entire afternoon simply walking without any particular destination in mind, of his growing weariness with a season that seemed to demand performance rather than honesty from everyone involved in it. "You don't seem terribly fond of London society," Eleanor observed, after he had described, with some dry humor, a dinner party where every guest had spent the evening competing to agree with the host's opinions on nearly everything discussed. "I'm not particularly," he admitted. "Most conversations here feel rehearsed long before they happen. Everyone already knows what they're supposed to say, and the trick is simply saying it more elegantly than the person beside them." He glanced at her, something curious in his expression. "You, on the other hand, seem to be saying exactly what you actually think, which I confess I find rather refreshing." "I suppose I've never had much practice at pretending," Eleanor said, and then, because his honesty seemed to invite her own, she added, "Or perhaps I simply gave up trying to impress people a long time ago, once I realized it rarely made any difference to how they treated me regardless." Something shifted in his expression at that, a flicker of genuine interest rather than polite curiosity, as though she had said something that mattered to him more than she understood. "That sounds like a story," he said quietly, "one I would very much like to hear if you're willing to tell it." Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much of her circumstances to share with a stranger, however easy his company had become. but there was something steady in the way he waited for her answer. No impatience, no assumption that she owed him an explanation, only genuine willingness to listen if she chose to speak. And so, carefully at first and then with growing openness, she told him something of her situation, not all of it, not yet, but enough. She spoke of her father's death, of a stepmother who had never quite learned to see her as family, of stepsisters whose triumphs had become the entire architecture of a household that had long since stopped making room for her own small hopes. She did not tell him her stepsisters had left her behind that very week to attend Lord Denby's ball. She did not mention that the gown she wore had belonged to her mother, remade by candlelight over long, careful evenings. She kept back the sharpest details, the ones that felt too raw to hand over to someone she had known for less than an hour, but she told him enough that he grew quiet, listening with an attentiveness she was not accustomed to receiving from anyone. "It seems to me," he said finally, when she had finished, "that a family fortunate enough to have you in it has done a rather poor job of recognizing what they possess." Elinor felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to such directness, unused to being spoken of as something valuable rather than something merely tolerated. "You're very kind to say so," she said, "though I suspect you say kind things to a great many people." "Not as many as you might think," he said, and something in his tone made her believe him entirely. Their conversation was interrupted, eventually, by the approach of an older woman in dove-gray silk. Her posture regal and her expression sharp, with the particular attentiveness of someone accustomed to being obeyed the moment she entered a room. Alexander's manner shifted subtly at her approach, a straightening of his shoulders, a small deference in his greeting that told Elinor, before a single word was spoken, that this woman held considerable authority over him. "Alexander," the woman said, her eyes moving briefly and assessingly over Elinor before returning to him, "your grandmother is asking after you. She grows impatient waiting to hear whether you intend to actually attend to your duties this evening or simply hide by the windows all night." "I was hardly hiding," Alexander said, though there was warmth rather than irritation in his voice. "I was having what may be the only genuinely interesting conversation of the entire evening." The older woman's gaze returned to Elinor with renewed interest, though her expression remained carefully neutral. "Is that so? And who is this young lady, then, who has managed to keep the Duke of Ashfield from his social obligations for the better part of an hour?" The words landed in Elinor's chest with the force of cold water. She looked at Alexander, at the man who had introduced himself with only a single easy word, no title, no ceremony, and understood in one dizzying moment exactly who she had been speaking with so freely for the past hour. The most sought-after, most carefully watched man in England, the very Duke her stepsisters had discussed with such calculated interest over ribbon swatches and wedding gowns, had been standing beside her at a window discussing books and honesty and disappointment, and she had had no idea at all. "Elinor Hartley," Alexander said, before Elinor could find her own voice to answer. "Cousin to Harriet Ashworth's family, and I suspect, the most honest person I have spoken with in a very long while." The older woman studied Elinor for a moment longer, something calculating and not entirely unkind in her expression, before offering a small, formal nod. "Well," she said, "how unusual. Do enjoy the rest of your evening, Miss Hartley." And with that, she moved away into the crowd, leaving behind an unmistakable air of having filed something important away for later consideration. Elinor turned back to Alexander, her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "You might have told me," she said, though there was no real anger in it, only astonishment. "I've been speaking to you this entire time as though you were simply a gentleman at a party." "I was simply a gentleman at a party," he said, an unmistakable warmth in his eyes. "For the first time in longer than I care to admit, I was allowed to be exactly that, without titles or expectations attached to every word I spoke. I rather enjoyed it, Miss Hartley, and I hope you're not too troubled to discover the truth." Elinor studied him for a long moment, weighing embarrassment against something else entirely, something warmer and more dangerous, a feeling she recognized but had not expected to encounter tonight of all nights. "I'm not troubled," she said finally. "Only surprised. I did not think a duke would find much of interest in a conversation with someone like me." "Then you have been keeping company with the wrong sort of people," Alexander said quietly, "for a very long time, I think." And though the string quartet continued to play and the party continued to murmur around them, for the rest of that evening, Alina found that the Duke of Ashfield seemed entirely uninterested in returning to it. In the days that followed the gathering at Rothwell House, Alina found herself returning again and again, in quiet, unguarded moments, to the memory of that conversation by the window. She had not expected to think of it so often, had not expected the warmth of it to linger the way it did, curling through her ordinary days like sunlight finding its way through a gap in heavy curtains. She scolded herself for it more than once, reminding herself firmly that a single pleasant evening meant nothing, that a duke's polite interest at a party was hardly the foundation for anything beyond a fond memory to be tucked away and eventually forgotten. And yet, 3 days after the gathering, a letter arrived at Grafton Street addressed once again to Alina by name, this time in a hand she recognized immediately from a single glimpse, bold and unhurried, exactly as she might have expected from the man who had written it. She took the letter to her room before anyone else in the house could notice its arrival, and there, with trembling fingers, she broke the seal. Alexander wrote simply, without excessive formality, asking whether she might be willing to walk with him in the public gardens near Grosvenor Square the following afternoon, accompanied, of course, by whatever companion propriety required. He mentioned nothing of titles or expectations, only that their conversation at Rothwell House had been the most honest exchange he had experienced in a very long time, and that he found himself unwilling to let it end there. Alina read the letter 3 times before she allowed herself to believe it was real. Then she went in search of Mrs. Fenwick, who, upon hearing the news, pressed both hands to her mouth in delighted disbelief, and immediately began working out which of her own married nieces might be persuaded to serve as a suitable companion for the outing, since Margaret Vane could certainly not be trusted with the truth of where Alina intended to spend her afternoon. The walk in the gardens became, over the following weeks, the first of many quiet, carefully arranged meetings between them. Alina told her stepmother she was visiting Harriet Ashworth, which was true often enough to keep the lie small and manageable, and Harriet, delighted to play her part in the small deception, welcomed Alina warmly each time and then, with a knowing smile, sent her off toward the gardens or the quiet corner of a museum, or, on one particularly memorable afternoon, a small bookshop tucked into a side street where Alexander had apparently been a regular customer for years. Each meeting revealed something new. Alina learned that Alexander had inherited his title far younger than he had expected, after his father's sudden death left him, at only 24, responsible for an estate and a family name he had not yet felt ready to carry. She learned that his grandmother, the sharp-eyed woman from the gathering, was the single most influential voice in his life, a woman who loved him fiercely but who also believed, with unshakable conviction, that his marriage ought to serve the family's interests above all else. "She has a list," Alexander admitted one afternoon as they walked slowly along a quiet garden path, autumn leaves gathering in soft drifts along the edges of the gravel. "An actual list, if you can believe it, of suitable young ladies, ranked by fortune and family connection. She updates it every season with great enthusiasm." "And where do I fall on this list?" Alina asked, half teasing, though something in her chest tightened slightly as she waited for his answer. "You don't appear on it at all," Alexander said, "which I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, to be the single most appealing thing about you." He glanced at her, something serious beneath the lightness of his tone. "Every young lady on that list has been raised, quite deliberately, to want exactly what my grandmother wants from me. You are the first person I have spoken with in years who seems to want nothing from me at all, beyond honest conversation." Alina considered this carefully as they walked. "Perhaps that's because I never imagined I had any claim to want something from you," she said. "I still find it strange some days that you seek out my company at all." "Then you have spent far too long in a house that taught you to expect very little," Alexander said quietly, and I find I would like, very much, to help you unlearn that particular lesson." She did not know how to answer him, and so for a while they simply walked in comfortable silence, the kind that had grown easier and more familiar with each meeting, until it no longer needed filling with conversation to feel complete. Elinor found herself, in those weeks, becoming someone she barely recognized from the quiet, careful girl who had spent 6 years disappearing into the corners of her stepmother's house. She laughed more easily. She spoke her opinions without first calculating how they might be received. She began, slowly and cautiously, to believe that perhaps she was allowed to want things for herself, rather than simply accepting whatever scraps of attention and affection the world happened to leave behind for her. Alexander, for his part, seemed equally changed by their meetings, though in different ways. He spoke less often of duty and obligation when they were together, more often of small, ordinary things, a particular book he had enjoyed, a childhood memory of his father teaching him to ride, a private wish, admitted only once and never repeated, that he had been born to a quieter sort of life entirely, one without the constant weight of titles and expectations pressing down on every decision he made. "Do you ever wish you could simply walk away from all of it?" Elinor asked him once, during a quiet afternoon spent in the small bookshop, browsing shelves neither of them had any real intention of purchasing from. The title, the estate, all of it. Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Though I think what I actually want is not to walk away from it, but to carry it differently. My father carried the title as though it were a performance to be gotten through correctly. I would rather carry it as something closer to my own life, chosen rather than simply endured." He glanced at her, something unguarded in his expression. "I think, perhaps, you understand that better than anyone else I've spoken with in a very long time. You've spent years being told your place in a household that never valued you properly, and yet you never let it turn you bitter. I find that rather remarkable." "I came close to bitterness more than once," Elinor admitted. "There were evenings I sat alone while my stepsisters attended balls I was never invited to, and I did not feel remarkable at all. I felt forgotten." "You are not forgotten now," Alexander said quietly, and something in the simple certainty of his voice settled deep into her chest, warm and steady, like the first true comfort she had felt in years. It was during one of these quiet meetings, some weeks into their growing acquaintance, that Elinor first allowed herself to admit, if only privately, that what she felt for Alexander had grown into something far beyond simple friendship. It frightened her, this realization, not because of any doubt about her own feelings, but because of everything standing between a duke and a penniless stepdaughter with no fortune, no significant family connections beyond an elderly cousin, and no reasonable claim to a future anyone in London society would consider suitable. She thought of Alexander's grandmother and her careful list of appropriate young ladies. She thought of the whispers that would surely follow should their meetings ever become public, whispers questioning her intentions, her character, her right to occupy any space at all within Alexander's world. She thought, too, of her stepmother's likely reaction, should Margaret Vane ever learn that Elinor had captured the attention of the very man Cordelia had once discussed so carelessly over ribbon swatches, the most sought-after bachelor in England, the prize her stepsisters had assumed, without ever truly considering the alternative, would naturally belong to someone far more polished and far more fortunate than their overlooked stepdaughter. But when she was with Alexander, walking beside him through quiet gardens or sitting across from him in the hushed corner of a bookshop, these worries grew distant and manageable, softened by the simple, undeniable comfort of being truly seen by someone for the very first time in longer than she cared to remember. Whatever difficulties waited for them beyond these quiet, stolen afternoons, Elinor found herself unwilling, for now, to let those difficulties steal the happiness she had found in his company. She did not yet know how much longer they could keep their meetings secret, nor did she know what would happen once the secret inevitably came undone. She only knew, walking beside him beneath the golden autumn light, that for the first time since her father's death, she had found something in her life that felt entirely, undeniably her own. Secrets, however carefully kept, rarely survive long in a city as hungry for gossip as London during the height of its season. It was Lady Beatrice Whitmore who first noticed something amiss, and once she noticed, she was not the sort of woman to let a discovery like that pass quietly. Beatrice had spent the better part of 2 years positioning herself as the most obvious candidate for the Duke of Ashfield's attention. She was the daughter of an earl in her own right, possessed a fortune considerable enough to satisfy even the most demanding of marriage negotiations, and had, until recently, believed herself to be firmly established as the favored name on the elder duchess's careful list of suitable young ladies. She had danced with Alexander at every ball where their paths crossed, had positioned herself thoughtfully beside him at dinners, had cultivated, with quiet and deliberate patience, exactly the sort of familiarity she believed would eventually ripen into a proposal. What she had not expected, and what she discovered quite by accident one afternoon while taking her own turn through the public gardens near Grosvenor Square, was the sight of Alexander walking slowly along a quiet path, deep in conversation with a young woman Beatrice did not immediately recognize, a woman dressed plainly enough to suggest she belonged to no family of significant standing, yet who commanded the Duke's full and undivided attention in a manner Beatrice herself had never quite managed to achieve. She watched them for several minutes from a discreet distance, noting the ease between them, the way Alexander laughed at something the young woman said, an unguarded, genuine sound Beatrice had rarely heard from him even during their most successful conversations. By the time she returned home that evening, she had already begun making inquiries, and by the following week, she had learned enough to piece together the full and, to her mind, thoroughly unsuitable truth. The young woman was Eleanor Hartley, stepdaughter to Margaret Vane, a family with barely enough remaining fortune to see 2 daughters married respectably, let alone support a third who had apparently set her sights considerably higher than her circumstances warranted. Beatrice did not confront Eleanor directly, nor did she raise the matter with Alexander himself. Instead, she did what she understood far better than either of those options. She began, carefully and deliberately, to talk. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, a carefully worded observation dropped into conversation at exactly the right dinner party, exactly the right card table, exactly the right circle of women whose tongues moved as quickly and as sharply as her own. Within a fortnight, the whispers had reached every corner of London society Eleanor might reasonably have hoped to avoid. She first became aware of them at a small gathering hosted by Harriet Ashworth, where a woman she barely knew offered her a smile too sweet to be entirely sincere and asked, with poorly disguised curiosity, whether it was true that Miss Hartley had been seen walking with the Duke of Ashfield on more than one occasion. Eleanor answered carefully, neither confirming nor denying anything beyond a simple acknowledgment that she and the Duke were acquainted, but the damage, she quickly realized, had already been done. Speculation, once loosed into a room full of eager listeners, could not be recalled, and by the time she returned to Grafton Street that evening, she understood with a sinking heart that it was only a matter of time before the whispers reached her stepmother's ears as well. They reached Margaret Vane 3 days later, delivered by a visiting acquaintance who could barely contain her delight at being the one to share such delicious news. Eleanor was summoned to the drawing-room that very evening, and she walked in already knowing, from the particular stiffness of her stepmother's posture, that the conversation waiting for her would not be a pleasant one. "I am told," Margaret said, her voice carefully controlled in the way it always was just before it wasn't, "that you have been seen walking in public gardens with the Duke of Ashfield, repeatedly, without my knowledge, without any chaperone I arranged, and without so much as a single word to me about any of it." "I did not think it was necessary to inform you," Eleanor said carefully, "given how little interest you have generally shown in the details of my activities." "Do not be clever with me," Margaret snapped. "This is not some small matter of gossip I can afford to ignore. Do you have any understanding of what this means, if it becomes known that you have been pursuing a man so far above your station, without any real fortune or connection to justify such ambition? You will be laughed at. Worse, you will make this entire family a subject of mockery, just as Cordelia and Marguerite are securing their own places in society. "I am not pursuing anyone," Elinor said, though she felt heat rise in her cheeks at the accusation. "The Duke himself sought my company, not the reverse." Margaret's laugh was sharp and entirely without humor. "And you believe that? A man like that, seeking out the company of a girl with no dowry, no significant family name, no prospects of any kind?" "Elinor, I had thought you more sensible than this. Men like the Duke of Ashfield do not marry girls like you. At best, you will find yourself the subject of a passing amusement, discarded the moment something more suitable catches his attention. At worst, you will destroy whatever small reputation remains to this family, and take your stepsister's happiness down with you in the process." The words landed with a precision that suggested Margaret had chosen them carefully, aiming for exactly the places most likely to cause doubt to take root. Elinor left the drawing room that evening with her chest tight and her thoughts racing, and though she told herself firmly that her stepmother's cruelty was nothing new, nothing she had not weathered 100 times before, this particular cruelty found purchase in a way the others had not, because it touched directly on the one thing Elinor had allowed herself, cautiously, to hope for. Doubt once planted proved difficult to uproot. Elinor found herself, in the days that followed, turning Margaret's words over and over in her mind, examining them from every angle despite her best efforts to dismiss them entirely. What if her stepmother was right? What if Alexander's attention truly was nothing more than a passing amusement, a novelty to be enjoyed until something more suitable, someone with Beatrice Whitmore's fortune and family standing, eventually captured his lasting interest instead? She had allowed herself, over the past weeks, to imagine a future she had never dared imagine before, and now she found herself terrified of how much that imagined future had come to mean to her, and how completely its loss would devastate her if it proved, in the end, to be nothing more than a passing fancy on Alexander's part. She did not see him for nearly 2 weeks after her conversation with Margaret, avoiding the letters he sent, inventing excuses to Harriet Ashworth about why she could not visit as often as before. It was not that she wished to end their acquaintance, not truly, but she found she needed time to steady herself, to decide whether she could bear the risk of hoping for something that society itself seemed determined to insist was impossible. The whispers, meanwhile, continued to spread and sharpen. Beatrice Whitmore, sensing an opportunity too valuable to waste, ensured that the story grew more elaborate with each retelling, until Elinor found herself cast, in certain circles, as a calculating young woman who had deliberately schemed her way into the Duke's attention, using her father's old family connections as a convenient foothold from which to launch an ambitious and entirely inappropriate pursuit of a fortune far beyond her station. Cordelia and Marguerite, upon learning the full story, reacted with a mixture of astonishment, and Elinor noted with some bitterness undisguised jealousy. "You," Cordelia said one evening, staring at Elinor as though seeing her for the first time, "walking with the Duke of Ashfield. I can hardly credit it. What could he possibly see in you?" "Perhaps," Marguerite offered, with slightly more kindness than her sister, though still not entirely free of envy, "he simply hasn't yet realized how unsuitable a match it would be. These things rarely last, once a man comes to his senses." Elinor said nothing in response to either comment, though the words settled into her already fragile confidence like small, sharp stones. She began to wonder in her quieter moments whether she had been foolish to believe that someone like Alexander could truly want someone like her, not for a season's amusement, but for something lasting, something real. She thought of Beatrice Whitmore's fortune and family name, of the elder Duchess's careful list, of everything standing between her own quiet, uncertain existence and the grand, glittering world Alexander belonged to by birth and duty both. It was Mrs. Fenwick, once again, who offered the steadiest counsel through this difficult stretch. "You cannot let other people's small hearts convince you that your own worth is small as well," she said firmly, one evening as she helped Elinor mend a torn hem by the kitchen fire. "Your stepmother has spent years telling you that you deserve very little, because it suited her own purposes to keep you small and quiet and grateful for scraps. But that was always her failing, Alina, not the truth of who you are. If the Duke sees something worth valuing in you, and I do not doubt for a moment that he does, then perhaps it is time you trusted his judgment over the whispers of people who have never once troubled themselves to know you properly. Alina considered these words carefully in the days that followed, and slowly, cautiously, she began to feel her courage return. She thought of Alexander's steady voice telling her she was not forgotten, of the genuine warmth in his laughter, of the unguarded honesty that had passed so easily between them from that very first conversation by the window. Whatever doubts society wished to plant in her heart, she decided, she owed it to herself, and perhaps to him as well, to face them directly rather than allowing fear to make her decisions for her. She wrote to him that same evening, a short letter apologizing for her recent silence and asking, if he was still willing, whether they might meet once more. She did not yet know what waited for her on the other side of that letter, whether the whispers had already done their damage, whether Beatrice Whitmore's careful campaign had succeeded in turning Alexander's affections elsewhere. But she sealed the letter and sent it before her courage could fail her again, choosing, for perhaps the first time in her life, to reach directly for the thing she wanted rather than waiting quietly in the corner for it to be offered, or denied, by someone else's decision entirely. Alexander's reply came the very next morning, faster than Alina had dared to hope, and when she read it, standing alone in the quiet of her small room, she felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight and anxious for nearly 2 weeks. He wrote simply that her silence had worried him more than he cared to admit, that he had heard some of the whispers circulating through society, and had wondered, with growing concern, whether they had frightened her away from him entirely. He asked, with a directness that struck her deeply, whether she would meet him that very afternoon, not in the gardens where they had walked so many times before, but at Harriet Ashworth's home, where he intended to speak with her plainly about everything the gossip had stirred between them. Alina went, her heart pounding the entire carriage ride, uncertain whether she was walking toward reassurance or toward the ending she had feared during her 2 weeks of silence. But the moment she stepped into Harriet's small sitting room and saw Alexander rise to greet her, the steady warmth in his eyes told her everything she needed to know before he had spoken a single word. "I have heard the stories," he said, once they were alone, Harriet having tactfully excused herself to see about refreshments that neither of them particularly wanted. "That you schemed your way into my attention, that you used your father's old connections as a foothold for some ambitious pursuit of my fortune. I want you to know that I have not believed a single word of it, not for one moment." "I was afraid," Alina admitted, the words coming more easily now that she saw the sincerity in his face, "that you might begin to wonder whether there was some truth buried in it, even a small amount. My stepmother certainly believes there is nothing else it could be. She thinks it impossible that a man in your position could want anything real from someone in mine." "Your stepmother," Alexander said, his voice carrying an edge of quiet anger Alina had not heard from him before, "sounds like a woman who has spent years underestimating you for her own convenience, and I confess I have very little patience left for her opinion on the matter." He stepped closer, his expression softening. "Alina, I did not seek you out because of your father's connections, or because I imagined you might be an easy conquest, unprotected by fortune or family influence. I sought you out because from the very first conversation we had, you spoke to me as though I were simply a man, not a title, not a fortune, not a prize to be won. I have not felt so entirely myself with anyone in longer than I can remember." Alina felt tears gather, unexpected and unbidden, and for once she did not fight to hold them back. "I was so afraid," she admitted quietly, "that I had imagined all of it. That the whispers were closer to the truth than what I felt when I was with you." "They were not," Alexander said firmly, "and I intend to make that plain to anyone in London who still doubts it." Whatever quiet reassurance that conversation might have offered, however, proved far too fragile to withstand what waited for Alina when she returned to Grafton Street that evening. She arrived to find the house in a state of unusual disorder, servants moving quickly between rooms with anxious faces, and Margaret Vane pacing the front hallway with an expression of barely controlled panic that Alina had never before seen on her stepmother's carefully composed features. "Where have you been?" Margaret demanded, the moment she saw Alina step through the door. "Never mind, it hardly matters now. We are ruined, Alina, entirely ruined." The story emerged slowly, in fragments delivered between Margaret's anxious pacing and the arrival of a lawyer summoned urgently that same evening. The remaining Hartley investments, the last thin thread of income that had kept the household solvent for years despite its diminished circumstances, had been tied to a shipping venture that had, according to news arriving that very afternoon, been lost entirely at sea, along with every penny invested in it. There would be no more income from that source, not this year, not ever. Combined with the considerable expenses already committed toward Cordelia's and Marguerite's weddings, expenses that could not now be recovered or canceled without enormous embarrassment and financial penalty, the family stood, quite suddenly, on the edge of true and complete ruin. Worse still, the lawyer explained gravely, there remained an outstanding debt against the house itself, one Edmund Hartley had taken on in his final years without Margaret's full knowledge, a debt that would now come due far sooner than anyone had anticipated, given the loss of the shipping income that had been quietly servicing it. Without some infusion of funds, the house on Grafton Street itself, the only home Alina had ever known, would need to be sold within the year simply to satisfy the creditors. Margaret's panic curdled over the following days into something colder and more calculating. She summoned Alina to the drawing room once more, this time with a proposal that made Alina's stomach turn the moment she understood its full shape. "You must end whatever understanding exists between yourself and the Duke of Ashfield," Margaret said, without preamble. "Immediately and permanently." Alina stared at her, certain for a moment that she had misheard. "You wish me to end it, after everything you said about the impropriety of the connection in the first place?" "That was before I understood how it might be used," Margaret said, her voice tight with strain. "There is a gentleman, a Mr. Wexford, considerably older but very wealthy, who has expressed some interest in Cordelia despite her engagement to Lord Denby. If certain arrangements can be made, quietly, discreetly, his investment could save this family from ruin entirely. But Mr. Wexford is a proud man, Alina, and he will not tolerate the embarrassment of a scandal touching this household, and a stepdaughter pursuing a duke so far above her station, with London society whispering about ambition and scheming, is precisely the sort of scandal that could ruin such an arrangement before it even begins." Alina felt something cold settle into her chest, as she understood the full weight of what her stepmother was asking. "You wish me to give up Alexander," she said slowly, "so that Cordelia might secure a second, wealthier arrangement behind Lord Denby's back, and so that this family's finances might be saved through means that sound considerably more scheming than anything I have actually been accused of." "Do not moralize at me," Margaret snapped. "You have the luxury of pride because you have never once had to hold this household together with nothing but careful arrangements and quiet sacrifices. I am asking you to make one small sacrifice, Alina, one connection you have known for barely 2 months, in exchange for saving the only home you have ever had, and the futures of the 2 sisters who have grown up beside you these 6 years." "They have never once treated me as a sister," Alina said quietly, though the words cost her something to speak aloud. "And you have never once treated me as a daughter." "Perhaps not," Margaret said, and for a brief moment something almost like genuine regret flickered across her carefully composed face, quickly smoothed away again. "But I am asking regardless. This house, this family, whatever bonds exist or fail to exist between us, all of it depends now on choices made in the coming weeks. I am asking you to consider what you owe to the roof that has sheltered you these 6 years, whatever its faults, before you consider what you owe to a man you have known only since the summer." Alina left the drawing room that evening carrying a weight she had never before had to bear, the terrible, tangled question of what, precisely, she owed to people who had given her so little warmth in return, and whether that debt, however unfairly incurred, might still be real enough to demand real sacrifice. She thought of Mrs. Fenwick, who had no other home to go to should the house be sold, who had served this family faithfully for decades and would suffer along with everyone else if ruin truly arrived. She thought of Marguerite, gentle and uncertain, who had at least occasionally shown Elinor small kindnesses across the years. She thought, even, of her own father, who had loved this house and this family, complicated as it was, and who would surely have wished to see it saved rather than lost entirely to circumstances beyond anyone's full control. And she thought of Alexander, of his steady voice insisting she was not forgotten, of the warmth that had grown between them across quiet gardens and hushed bookshop corners, of a future she had allowed herself, cautiously and then with growing hope, to imagine sharing with him. She did not know, standing alone in her small room that night with the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on her chest, which debt she owed more completely, the one to a family who had sheltered but never truly loved her, or the one to her own quiet, long-suppressed hope for a happiness entirely her own. She only knew that whatever choice she made in the coming days would shape the whole of the life still waiting for her, and that for the first time since her father's death, she would have to decide, entirely for herself, exactly what kind of life that would be. For 3 days, Elinor said nothing to anyone about the choice pressing down on her, not to Mrs. Fenwick, not to Harriet Ashworth, not even to Alexander himself, though he wrote twice during that stretch asking whether something had troubled her. She could not bring herself to answer honestly, uncertain as she still was of what her answer to her stepmother's demand would ultimately be. It was Marguerite, of all people, who finally broke the silence. She found Elinor alone in the garden on the 3rd evening, sitting on the old stone bench beneath the bare branches of the oak tree that had stood there since before either of them was born, and she sat down beside her without invitation, something unusually serious in her expression. "I know what Mother has asked of you," Marguerite said quietly. "I overheard part of the conversation, and I have thought of little else since." Elinor said nothing, uncertain what response her stepsister expected or deserved. "I want you to know," Marguerite continued, twisting her hands together in her lap, "that I do not think it fair, what she is asking. Whatever debts this family owes, they are not debts you created, and it seems terribly wrong to ask you to pay for them with the one good thing that has happened to you in years, while Cordelia gains a second fortune through arrangements no more honest than anything you have been accused of." "I did not expect you to say that," Elinor admitted, genuinely surprised. "I have not always been kind to you," Marguerite said, her voice unsteady. "None of us have, not really, and I think I have known that for a long while without ever finding the courage to say so or to act differently. But I saw you, that evening after you began meeting the Duke, and you looked happier than I have ever seen you look in all the years I have known you. I do not think Mother has any right to ask you to give that up simply because the timing has become inconvenient for the rest of us." Elinor felt something loosen in her chest at these unexpected words, a small crack of warmth in what had otherwise felt like an entirely lonely burden. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I did not know you noticed." "I notice more than anyone in this family gives me credit for," Marguerite said, with a small, rueful smile. "I am not so foolish as Mother sometimes believes." That conversation, small as it was, gave Elinor the courage she had been missing to finally act. That same evening she wrote to Alexander, asking him to meet her the following afternoon, and this time she resolved to tell him everything: the debt threatening the house, her stepmother's demand, the impossible weight of choosing between the family that had raised her, however imperfectly, and the future she had begun, cautiously, to hope for. They met in the same public gardens where their earliest conversations had unfolded, though the autumn leaves had mostly fallen now, leaving the bare branches stark against a pale gray sky. Elinor told him everything, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly with the effort of the confession, and Alexander listened without once interrupting, his expression growing graver with every detail she revealed. "And what have you decided?" he asked once she had finished. "I do not know," Elinor admitted. "I know what I want, Alexander, more clearly than I have known anything in a very long time, but I also know what it would cost the people who raised me, however poorly, if I chose that want over their need. I do not know how to weigh those two things fairly against each other." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the bare garden, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that steadied something deep inside her chest. You should not have to choose between your own happiness and the survival of a house that has given you so little warmth in return, he said. But I understand why the choice feels impossible regardless. Will you allow me to speak with your stepmother directly? I believe there may be a solution here that does not require you to sacrifice anything at all. Elinor hesitated, uncertain what he intended, but something in his steady confidence persuaded her to agree. He came to Grafton Street 2 days later, arriving unannounced in a manner that sent the entire household into a frenzy of anxious preparation, the moment his carriage was recognized at the gate. Margaret received him in the drawing room with a composure that only barely concealed her astonishment, while Cordelia and Marguerite hovered near the doorway, unable to resist witnessing whatever conversation was about to unfold. Alexander wasted little time on pleasantries. I understand, he said, once the initial greetings had been exchanged, that this household faces considerable financial difficulty, and that you have asked Elinor to end her acquaintance with me in exchange for an arrangement that might ease that difficulty through your daughter Cordelia. Margaret's composure faltered visibly, her eyes flicking toward Elinor with something like betrayal, though Elinor met her gaze steadily, unashamed of having shared the truth. I do not know what Elinor has told you, Margaret began carefully, but the situation is considerably more complicated than. I do not doubt that it is complicated, Alexander interrupted, not unkindly but with an authority that left no room for evasion. Debt and desperation rarely simplify a family's choices. But I want to be entirely plain with you, Lady Vane. I have no intention of ending my acquaintance with Elinor, regardless of what arrangement you hope to secure through her sacrifice. And I find myself deeply troubled that you would ask her to make such a sacrifice at all, given how little this household appears to have offered her in return across the years she has lived here. The room fell into a heavy silence. Cordelia, near the doorway, looked as though she wished to disappear entirely, while Marguerite watched with an expression that carried something close to quiet satisfaction. What I propose instead, Alexander continued, is this. I'm prepared to settle the outstanding debt against this house myself, not as payment for Elinor's hand, which is not mine to purchase and never will be, but simply as a gesture of respect for a family connection that matters to people I care for, namely Elinor and her cousin Harriet Ashworth. I ask nothing in return beyond this, that Elinor be permitted to make her own choices from this point forward, without further pressure or manipulation regarding matters that concern her own heart. Margaret stared at him, clearly torn between relief at the offer and humiliation at how plainly he had exposed her scheme in front of her own daughters. That is extraordinarily generous, she managed finally. I am not certain I understand why you would extend such generosity to a family that has treated your acquaintance with Elinor with such suspicion. Because Elinor deserves better than the choice you asked her to make, Alexander said simply, and because I find I cannot stand by and watch someone I care for be forced to sacrifice her own happiness to solve problems that were never hers to solve in the first place. He turned then to Elinor, who stood near the window with tears gathering, unashamed now in her eyes. I did not come here today only to settle a debt, he said, his voice softening as he addressed her directly, seemingly indifferent to the fact that her entire stepfamily stood witness to the moment. I came because I wanted to say plainly, in front of everyone who has ever doubted your worth, that I have never once cared about your fortune, or your family's standing, or anything else London society believes makes a person suitable or unsuitable for my attention. I care about the honesty you offered me from the very first conversation we shared, the courage you have shown facing every difficulty this family has placed before you, and the simple, undeniable fact that I have never felt more entirely myself than I do in your company. Elinor Hartley, I am asking you here and now whether you will do me the honor of becoming my wife. The room seemed to hold its breath entirely, Margaret frozen in stunned silence, Cordelia's mouth falling open in open astonishment, Marguerite pressing a hand to her chest with something like delighted tears already gathering in her own eyes. Elinor crossed the room slowly, scarcely able to believe the moment was real, and when she finally reached him, she found she did not need to search long for her answer. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, I will." Whatever whispers had followed her through London society these past weeks, whatever doubts her stepmother had tried to plant, whatever impossible choice had weighed on her these last difficult days, all of it dissolved in that single moment, standing before the man who had chosen her, plainly and publicly, exactly as she was. News of the engagement spread through London faster than any scandal Beatrice Whitmore had ever managed to construct. And this time the story that traveled from drawing room to drawing room was not one of scheming ambition, but of a duke who had chosen love and honesty over fortune and family standing. A story so unusual and so romantic that it captured the imagination of the entire season. Beatrice herself, upon hearing the news, withdrew from society for several weeks, her careful campaign against Elinor's reputation having ultimately accomplished nothing beyond making her own disappointment a matter of public curiosity. The wedding was set for early spring, and the months leading up to it transformed the house on Grafton Street in ways Elinor could scarcely have imagined only a season before. With the debt settled through Alexander's generosity, Margaret's desperate scheming gave way, however grudgingly, to a new and careful civility toward her stepdaughter, though Elinor noticed, with some private amusement, that her stepmother's respect seemed to have grown considerably faster than her genuine warmth. Cordelia, for her part, took rather longer to adjust to the idea that the stepsister she had spent years overlooking would soon outrank both herself and Marguerite in society, and there were several tense weeks during which she alternated between exaggerated friendliness and barely concealed resentment, uncertain which approach might better serve her own standing now that Elinor's fortunes had shifted so dramatically. Marguerite, alone among her stepfamily, seemed genuinely and consistently glad for Elinor's happiness, and the two young women, who had never before shared much beyond a house and a surname, found themselves growing into something that resembled real friendship in the months before the wedding, bonded by long conversations about the strange, unpredictable turns their lives had taken. The wedding itself, held at a small church near Rothwell House, rather than the grand cathedral many had expected, was attended by family both old and new, Harriet Ashworth beaming with pride throughout the entire ceremony, Mrs. Fenwick weeping openly in a pew near the back, having been given a place of honor Elinor had insisted upon despite the raised eyebrows it caused among certain more conventional guests. Alexander's grandmother, the sharp-eyed duchess who had first learned Elinor's name at that fateful gathering months before, watched the ceremony with an expression that had softened, over the intervening weeks, from cautious skepticism into something that might, with enough time, grow into genuine affection. Elinor wore, at her own insistence, a gown made from the same green silk her mother had once worn to her own presentation, altered once more, this time not for economy but for beauty, by a seamstress Mrs. Fenwick had personally selected and supervised with fierce pride. Standing at the altar in that gown, looking out at a small church full of people who had, in their own imperfect ways, become her family, Elinor found herself thinking often of her father, wishing he could have lived to see this day, though she believed, in her quieter moments, that he would have been deeply proud of the woman she had become despite everything that had been asked of her in his absence. Alexander, waiting for her at the front of the church, watched her walk toward him with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that Elinor felt, for the first time in her adult life, entirely and completely certain that she belonged exactly where she stood. In the years that followed, Elinor's transformation from overlooked stepdaughter to Duchess of Ashfield became one of the most fondly remembered stories of that particular London season, told and retold not because of the title she had gained, but because of the quiet dignity with which she had carried herself through every difficulty leading up to it. She never forgot the years of feeling invisible in her own home, and that memory shaped, in lasting and meaningful ways, the woman she became once she finally had the standing and the means to act on her own convictions. She invited Mrs. Fenwick to live at Rothwell House permanently, insisting the older woman had earned a peaceful retirement after decades of faithful service. And Mrs. Fenwick, though she protested at first out of long habit, eventually accepted, becoming a beloved and permanent fixture of Aliner's new household. She maintained a genuine, growing friendship with Marguerite, whose own marriage to Lord Camden proved a happy one, and the two women continued to visit each other regularly, their earlier distance replaced by real warmth built slowly and honestly over shared years. Her relationship with Cordelia remained more complicated, marked by occasional flashes of the old rivalry and resentment, though even that relationship softened gradually as the years passed, and old wounds lost some of their sharpness. Margaret Vane, for her part, learned to speak of Aliner's marriage with a pride that had, at first, been entirely performed for the benefit of society, but which grew, slowly and reluctantly, into something that resembled genuine respect, if never quite the warmth Aliner had once hoped for as a grieving 16-year-old newly arrived in that house. Aliner and Alexander built together, a marriage founded on exactly the honesty that had first drawn them to each other by that window at Rothwell House. Alexander carried his title differently than his father had, exactly as he had once hoped he might, choosing it as something lived rather than merely performed. And Aliner stood beside him through every difficulty and every celebration, never forgetting the years of feeling forgotten that had shaped her into someone who understood, more deeply than most in her position ever would, exactly how much it mattered to see people clearly and to treat them with genuine kindness, regardless of their fortune or their standing. The story of the poor heiress chosen by England's most eligible duke, while her stepsisters married comfortable earls through careful calculation and social maneuvering, became, in time, less a piece of London gossip and more a quiet lesson repeated among those who had known Aliner's full journey. Fortune and family standing, it turned out, mattered a good deal less than the world had once insisted, when weighed against honesty, resilience, and the simple, undeniable power of being truly seen by someone willing to look past everything society told them mattered most. 5 years passed, and Rothwell House, once known throughout London primarily for its grandeur and its history, became known instead, among those who visited often enough to see past its formal walls, for its warmth. Aliner had changed it slowly, room by room, season by season, not by tearing down what had come before, but by softening it, filling it with the kind of quiet welcome she herself had longed for during her years at Grafton Street. She and Alexander had by then 2 children, a daughter named Charlotte who had inherited her mother's steady, thoughtful gaze, and a younger son named Edmund, named for the grandfather he would never meet, whose easy laughter reminded Aliner, in unguarded moments, of her father's own warmth. She often sat with them in the garden where she and Alexander had first walked together as something more than strangers, telling them small pieces of the story, carefully chosen for their ages, about how their mother had once mended curtains by candlelight and dreamed, on her quietest evenings, of a life where she might finally be seen. Mrs. Fenwick, now considerably older but no less sharp in her affections, remained a beloved presence in the household, delighting in spoiling the children with stories and small kindnesses in exactly the way she had once tried, faithfully and often at some personal cost, to look after Aliner herself. She liked to tell Charlotte, whenever the girl asked, that her mother had once been the quietest, most overlooked young woman in all of London, and that the very same qualities everyone had once dismissed, her honesty, her patience, her refusal to grow bitter despite every unkindness, had turned out in the end to be exactly what made her extraordinary. Marguerite visited often, her own children growing up alongside Aliner's in a friendship neither of their mothers had ever expected to share back when they lived under the same difficult roof. The 2 women had, over the years, built something neither of them had experienced during their own childhoods, a sisterhood chosen freely and maintained with genuine care, rather than one merely assigned by circumstance and never properly tended. Cordelia's path proved harder, though not without its own eventual softening. Her marriage to Lord Denby, built more on calculation than affection, grew strained over the years in ways that taught her, slowly and sometimes painfully, lessons Elinor had learned far earlier and at far greater personal cost. It was Elinor, in the end, who reached out first during one of Cordelia's more difficult seasons, offering quiet support without judgment or reminder of old grievances. And though their relationship never grew as close as Elinor's friendship with Marguerite, it grew, at last, into something honest, something built on mutual respect rather than old rivalry. Margaret Vane, in her final years, came to live for a time at a smaller property Alexander arranged near Rothwell House, close enough for regular visits but separate enough to preserve the boundaries Elinor had carefully learned to maintain. Their relationship never became the warm, easy bond Elinor had once longed for as a grieving girl of 16, but it settled, eventually, into a kind of peace, built on the older woman's genuine, if late arriving, recognition of everything she had failed to offer her stepdaughter across those difficult early years. On her deathbed, Margaret spoke plainly for perhaps the first time in her life, telling Elinor that she had been wrong, profoundly wrong to treat her as she had, and thanking her with tears that surprised them both, for the grace she had shown in return despite every reason not to. Elinor held her stepmother's hand through those final quiet hours, finding, to her own surprise, that forgiveness had grown easier with time and distance than she ever could have imagined during her hardest years at Grafton Street. Alexander, meanwhile, had grown into exactly the kind of duke he had once hoped to become, carrying his title as something lived rather than merely performed, exactly as he had told Elinor he wished to during their earliest conversations together. He remained, throughout their marriage, the same steady, honest man who had first sought her company by a window because he was weary of flattery and calculation, and Elinor often found, watching him with their children or listening to him speak with genuine warmth to servants and tenants alike, that the qualities which had first drawn her to him had only deepened with time rather than fading, as she had once feared they might. Their household became known, in time, for a particular kind of generosity, quiet scholarships offered to young women without fortune or family standing, support extended to servants and tenants facing hardship, an open and genuine welcome offered to guests regardless of their wealth or connections. Elinor never forgot what it felt like to stand outside a drawing-room door, listening to laughter that excluded her entirely, and she made certain, in every choice available to her as Duchess, that no one under her care or influence would ever have to carry that particular loneliness without someone noticing and reaching out. On quiet evenings, when the children had been put to bed and the great house had settled into its familiar hush, Elinor and Alexander often sat together by the fire in the same drawing-room where his grandmother had once eyed her so carefully at that fateful gathering years before. The old Duchess, in her final years before passing peacefully in her sleep, had grown to love Elinor as genuinely as she had once doubted her, often remarking, with the same sharp humor that had first unsettled Elinor at their introduction, that she had never once regretted crossing Elinor's name off her careful list of suitable young ladies, because the young woman who had never appeared on that list at all had turned out to be worth considerably more than every name that had. Elinor thought often, in these quiet moments, of the frightened, overlooked girl she had once been, standing in a cold hallway with a dying candle, listening to a door close on a future she believed had never truly included her. She thought of the letter that had arrived so unexpectedly, of the green silk gown carefully remade by lamplight, of the conversation by a window that had changed the entire shape of her life. She had learned, across those difficult years, and the happier ones that followed, that worth was never truly determined by fortune or family standing, no matter how loudly society insisted otherwise, but by the quiet, steady courage to remain honest and kind even when the world offered very little reason to be either. Her stepsisters had married rich earls, secured through careful calculation and years of deliberate positioning, exactly as their mother had always planned. But Elinor, the poor and overlooked heiress no one had thought to include, had found something neither fortune nor careful scheming could ever fully purchase, a love built entirely on honesty, chosen freely by a man who had looked past every obstacle society placed between them and seen, from that very first conversation, exactly who she truly was. And so, in the grand house that had once seemed impossibly distant from the quiet, careful life she had known on Grafton Street, Eleanor Hartley, now Duchess of Ashfield, found the ending she had never dared to imagine for herself during those long, lonely years of being overlooked. Not simply a title or a fortune, but a genuine home, built on love that had chosen her exactly as she was, and a family both given and chosen that would never again let her feel forgotten.